Hello again. In this lecture, we are going to discuss the differences in dominance in society versus subordination in society. So, in a society like the United States and other societies that have a lot of diversity of ascribed status and socioeconomic level, such as the United States does, there always emerges a dominant group and subordinate groups that don't fit the same characteristics the dominant group has. Okay, so what we need, in order to understand this, we need to go all the way back to chapter 4 with our ascribed and achieved statuses, and also know everything that we need to about life chances and those different socioeconomic statuses that make up USA society, and all of those factors kind of filter into these 4 corresponding characteristics that I have on the board behind me about what constitutes a dominant group in society versus what constitutes a subordinate group in society. So, and remember, or maybe I didn't say this. I think I said this to my cultural geography class and maybe not a sociology class. So forgive me if I'm repeating, but I think I need to say that we really should not use the words majority when we mean dominant, because majority implies that it has larger numbers of people in the population in comparison to other categories of people in the population, and that doesn't always mean dominant. You can have very numerous amounts of people that fit your category in a society, but you might not be the ones who are in control. So we need to steer away from using the words minority and majority, and instead, when we're talking about control, power, and dominance, we should say dominant categories of people versus subordinate categories, or anybody who is subjected to the dominant norms that are established according to the dominant category of people. Okay, I'm sure I could have said that with a simpler sentence, so sorry that I kind of tripped over my words and said the same word 4 or 5 times in the same sentence, but let's use dominant and subordinate, not majority and minority, because power does not always equal more numbers of people. Okay. So here's how we distinguish dominant versus subordinate groups in a society. And in our next video, we will look at the United States specifically to identify the most dominant of dominant groups in our society, so that we can identify what otherness means as far as subordinate groups go. Okay. So the dominant group and subordinate group, the first characteristic that we're going to use to identify them is the dominant group, the people in power, have particular physical characteristics in common with each other. Now, I didn't list which ones here because this is a general list of characteristics that can be applied to any society on earth. We can apply this to Saudi Arabia, we can apply this to India, we can apply this to China, we can apply this all over the place. There would be a certain particular set of physical characteristics that are typical of the dominant group. And then if you had physical characteristics that were not descriptive of the dominant group, that would be one of the ways that you could be identified as subordinate in society. So, physical characteristics, we know, could mean your sex category. It could mean your racial category. So, these ascribed statuses could be part of your subordination or dominance in society. The second characteristic that we can note about a dominant group is that members of the dominant group have full rights and privileges in society. And that's typically seen as, by design, they have full rights and privileges because typically the dominant group is the one historically in charge with establishing society to begin with. So they have full rights and privileges because when they were designing society, they had their own background in mind at the forefront of their minds. That's not to mean that they intentionally or maliciously left out people, but it's just a fact that most of the time we consider our own point of view before we open our mind to other points of view, or even realize that other points of view might differ from our own. So it's not necessarily an intentional thing, and this is not done by just one person in a dominant group. Somebody's got to be dominant, and so there is dominance that's established over time, and the people who are in the dominant group have the most in common with the dominant group, enjoy full rights and privileges in those societies. As opposed to subordinate groups, they have limited rights and privileges. So let's look at something. We had the 100-year anniversary of women's suffrage last year. And women's suffrage is the social movement that women undertook. They fought for social change so that they could have the right to vote. They didn't have a voice in politics in our nation. I've used Saudi Arabia as an example a couple of times in class, and so let me talk about Saudi Arabia and women's right to vote. I believe it was 2012. Y'all can look it up to make sure, but I think it was 2012, not 1920 like in the United States, but 2012 when women got the right to vote in Saudi Arabia. And there's still some other restrictions, like, for instance, they can't, I believe it's still in place that they can't go in public without a man to accompany them. So a lot of women, even though they had the right to vote, couldn't vote, because if your brother, husband, father, uncle didn't approve of you voting, then they wouldn't accompany you in public, and therefore you couldn't go to the polling place. But that's an example of limited rights and privileges of people who are subordinate to the dominant group. In this case, males and females, haves versus have-nots. Males are the haves, females are the have-nots for the dominant versus subordinate group with the right to vote, for instance. Okay. So the dominant group also over time develops the macro scale set of norms and social facts that everybody in society is subjected to. Therefore, if you are a member of the dominant group, in your socialization process, you probably learned behaviors, you probably learned standards for activities and for goals in life and for belief systems and for patterns of behavior that fit the normative standard. Some of you might have heard the term heteronormativity, which is the assumption that heterosexuality is, quote, normal for the human species, and therefore the assumed standard for sexual behavior is heteronormativity. So this word normative, that's what it means. It's about assumptions. It's about macro level parts of the social structure, the social facts that we inherit at birth. And sometimes your ascribed status will put you into a group that fits that normative standard for the most part, and other times your ascribed status identifies you as other because you don't fit that normative standard that has been established over time by the dominant group. A religion is another thing that could be a normative standard. For instance, the United States is seen as a Christian nation. Saudi Arabia is seen as an Islamic state, and therefore Islam is the dominant normative standard in that nation, and Christianity is the normative standard in our nation. Now, you don't have to be Islamic in Saudi Arabia, just like you don't have to practice Christianity in the United States, but if you are other than that, then you stand out as odd. You stand out as different. If you are Jewish, Buddhist, Hindi, Wiccan, anything that you are in the United States, we have freedom of religion, so you can practice that, but you don't fit the normative standard. And some of the practices that might be approved of in your religious system, like for instance, maybe polygamy is a practice that is allowed in many religious systems, but not in Christianity. And therefore, monogamy is the normative standard for Christianity and marriage in the United States. And so there's lots of different ways we can pick out normative standards. And lots of different ways that you can be other based on those normative standards. I have some of them listed here. Please notice that most of them are ascribed statuses. Okay? Also, the dominant group typically operates on exclusivity, maybe racial purity, maybe religious fundamentalism. Often, the dominant group encourages its members to marry within the dominant group to kind of keep power in place or to keep purity of the group in place. But on the other side, for the subordinate group, your group identity and therefore the common social identity that you, or social experience that you share of subordination, of oppression, maybe, of mistreatment, of being other and not having full rights and limited, all of these things above this number 4 create life experiences known as intersectionality. You have multiple parts of your social identity based on multiple achieved and ascribed statuses that can differentiate you from the dominant group. And based on that marginality that you experience, you can have a lot of different social experiences than those of the dominant group. And when you see someone else who shares those physical features, ethnic features, sexual preference or sexuality, because sexual preference isn't, I didn't mean to say that, scratch that, sexuality, say that, your religious group, etc., all of these different things that are ascribed to you, you can have a common social experience or an understanding and feeling of solidarity, which is a feeling of oneness or group unity, just because of the assumed common social experience and background that you have in relationship to the dominant power structures in society. So these are the basic background, the basic characteristics that can identify a dominant group from a subordinate group. There can be tons of subordinate groups or ways to define a subordinate group in comparison to the dominant group. And people who are dominant in the United States are not the same categories of people and ascribed statuses and achieved statuses of people who are dominant in India or Saudi Arabia or South Africa or China or any of the other places, because culture is different from place to place. And therefore, these social definitions of race, ethnicity, gender, those kinds of things are going to be viewed differently and defined differently from one place to the next. But dominant versus subordinate is about power and lack of power. And that's the way that we're going to look at these achieved statuses, ascribed statuses from chapter 9 and 10 in relationship to your position in social stratification overall and your life chances that you have for success or achievement. That's where the achievement comes in, your life chances for that based on your ascribed status. Okay, text me with questions, and there's more to come this week.